them out.
So it looks like we've got, we're in the middle of Game 3. Todd and Dalton both at 10-2 with their respective decks. And it appears that Todd has a board presence and Dalton does not. Todd has got a Tarmogoyf, a Voice of Resurgence of Plains, a Temple Garden, and a Stomping Grounds on the battlefield. The Tarmogoyf is going to be a 3-4. Dalton has a Stirring Wildwood, a Shambling Vent, so a couple of creature lands. He's got a Plains and a Godless Shrine, but now he has a Siege Rhino, and things will change a little bit.
Yeah, things will change a little bit, but not a lot. That Siege Rhino isn't really going to trump the Tarmogoyf. Likely these two players will get into a board stall, but the thing that's a little tricky is Todd Stevens actually has more big creatures than Dalton does. So in a long game where each half of the board is just developing creatures and lining them up, Todd actually starts to come out ahead in that regard. A lot of the times these black-green mid-range decks, they'll rely on a card like Dark Confidant to get a lot of card advantage and pull them ahead, or Liliana to start whittling away at your opponent's board. And Dalton, he has 3 Liliana, but he has no Dark Confidants. So he may find himself in a situation where he does a lot of trading, but he may actually come out behind.
So it looks like Todd is just going to play a land and pass on 4 mana here, which is going to signify something like Collected Company to me. And Dalton is just going to go ahead and play a Liliana and minus it, targeting Todd. So I imagine that we might see a Voice of Resurgence bite the dust here, make an elemental token, and then potentially become a 4-4 with this Collected Company that Todd Stevens is representing in his hand.
Yeah, and what's dicey about this is the back half of Voice is almost better than the front half.
Yeah, if you're not a deck with remans and a bunch of instant speed things, that's absolutely true.
Yeah, and I mean, now Todd Stevens is going to be able to fire off a Collected Company. If he gets 2 creatures off of it, his Voice of Resurgence token will be a 4-4. If he can play another creature, his Voice of Resurgence will be a 5-5. And now the Siege Rhino won't be able to block it, and Todd might be able to, snipe that Liliana.
But it's also possible that he could take care of the Liliana with something like a Lightning Bolt, which will be very valuable for that Tarmogoyf, as it'll put a Planeswalker in the graveyard, which is not something that's normally going to be in there, and make it easy for that Tarmogoyf to become a 5-6 and be bigger than that Siege Rhino.
Yeah, for sure. One thing that's interesting about this, just to kind of talk a little bit more about the various brands of green-black decks, the Abzan deck typically is a little bit better in green-black mirrors because a deck like Jund really wants to focus on card advantage, and the Abzan deck can force the game to be about life totals. But in this sort of situation, the fact that the Abzan deck, it doesn't have Dark Confidant, doesn't have a card like Olivia Valdarin that can really dominate the board, can make these Naya Company decks a lot hard to fight.
So it looks like Todd was able to find a Tarmogoyf and a Wild Nacatl off of that Collected Company. He does have a lot of power on the battlefield at this point, but it looks like he has just a bunch of lands in his hand. So it's going to be interesting to see how he decides to try and push through some damage against Dalton and his Siege Rhino holding down the fort.
Yeah.
Now Dalton does have 2 mana potentially available, which could be something like a Path to Exile or an Abrupt Decay, which can take out an attacker and shrink that Voice of Resurgence token. So Todd does have to be pretty careful in this combat step with what he decides to do.
Yeah, underneath that Plains, do you know if that's a Temple Garden or a Stirring Wildwood?
It looks like it's a Temple Garden.
Okay.
So unfortunately, we don't have a Stirring Wildwood on Todd Stevens' side. We do have one on Dalton's side, which might come into play later on in this game.
Yeah.
So Todd looks like he's just going to attack with all of his creatures. So it'll be interesting to see where he plans on sending any of them.
One thing that's interesting is for the time being, he kind of can ignore the Liliana simply because
he just has a bunch of lands in his hand.
Right, exactly. So the plus on Liliana might hurt Dalton more than it hurts Todd. And for this attack step, Todd can push a lot of damage and potentially force Dalton into a bad scenario.
So it looks like it's just Todd Stevens is going to smork it up and go all to Dalton's face. Dalton did put his Siege Rhino in front of one of those 3-4 Tarmogoyfs. He's going to go ahead and take what looks to be 10 damage on that attack, having his life total. But I can understand why Todd would do that. He just has all lands in his hand, just needs to try and get something going before Dalton can mount a board presence here and try and make the game stall out. Now that Liliana discard is very interesting. It's going to make that Tarmogoyf a 4-5.
Yeah, I'm sure that's a calculated risk on Dalton. He just, I'm surprised that he didn't just play the second Liliana and minus it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, actually. I feel like that would be much better. With Todd Stevens having 3 cards in hand, just getting one of a random one with the Liliana activation doesn't really seem like it's going to do the best thing. Oh, and here we have a Languish, which would have killed that Tarmogoyf had he cast the Languish before he activated his Liliana. So I feel like that has to be a slight misstep by Dalton, and I imagine he's probably a little sad at himself for now.
Yeah. Well, the one thing that I do like about this is I was talking about how a card like Olivia Voldaren can really dominate the board. Languish is a card that can really dominate the board too, so I really like that Dalton has it in for this matchup.
Absolutely. So, and now Languish is actually the only sorcery, so that even is going to grow the Tarmogoyf one more up to a 5/6.
Yeah, and we can see how when it comes to big creatures, the Todd Stevens has the bigger creatures as opposed to Dalton. I mean, Dalton has cards like Lingering Souls that are kind of a small amount of power and toughness for the amount of mana that he's spending. And if it comes down to just who has the bigger creatures, Todd Stevens is going to win this fight.
So it looks like Todd has just picked up a copy of Knight of the Reliquary, which has the potential to be giant.
Yeah, this could be really big. I assume this Tarmogoyf is going at the Liliana because that would force Dalton to either chump with the Rhino or just lose the Liliana, effectively making his Tarmogoyf live.
So it looks like that Tarmogoyf would have actually lived through the Languish because the sorcery would have grown it. However, he could have... that's why he didn't play the second Liliana. Then he wouldn't have had the mana to cast the Languish.
Well, I think the Languish doesn't work the same way Lightning Bolt does, so if the Tarmogoyf... Well, I don't know. We can clear that up later.
Yeah, I did have that checked, and the Tarmogoyf would have lived, unfortunately.
All right, cool. Glad we got that cleared up.
Well, Dalton is going to have a 5/6 Tarmogoyf of his own, which is quite formidable. And I wonder how large that Knight of the Reliquary is. Unfortunately, Todd Stevens has stacked his... Oh, there we go.
It's probably an infinite.
Yeah, probably.
I mean, the thing is, basically, we're at a little bit of a board stall, but the thing that is most relevant is the Knight of the Reliquary can actually do something in a board stall.
Yeah.
I mean, when both players are at the mercy of their own draw steps and they just have some stuff on the board, having stuff on the board that has non-combat activated abilities is really something that can pull you ahead.
So it looks like the Knight is an 8/8, which is very large. Plus, at this point, I do believe that Todd has a copy of Kessig Wolfrun in his deck, which could prove to be very good in this board stall with these Tarmogoyfs faring off, giant Knight of the Reliquaries, and we're even in a sideboarded match, so I have to imagine that Todd might have something like Elspeth Knight Errant in his deck, and if he happens to draw one of those, that Knight of the Reliquary can end the game on the spot, because Dalton is only at 9 life.
Yeah, this Knight of the Reliquary, it'll be interesting to see how Todd uses it, because he can use it to fetch up a manland or a Horizon Canopy if he wants to get ahead on cards. He can also use it for a Kessig Wolfrun, which I think would be his most aggressive option. So it'll be interesting to see exactly what he wants to get.
So it looks like he's going to activate this Knight, sacrificing his Sacred Foundry. He does have a Horizon Canopy that he's thumbed to the top of his deck there, but he might go back in and change to a Kessig Wolfrun.
Yeah.
It looks like that's what he's going to find, is that Kessig Wolfrun. It's going to represent a lot of damage depending on how Dalton blocks if he decides to start attacking. And
yeah. This is essentially going to make it so that Todd Stevens is going to be able to attack next turn, most likely with his Tarmogoyf, and he's essentially going to force a 2-for-1 trade. It's going to be his Tarmogoyf with a Kessig Wolfrun pump trading with 2 of Dalton's creatures. Maybe the Stirring Wildwood and the Siege Rhino, I assume, would be the most likely guess.
Ooh, and that's a Ghost Quarter that Todd just found, which is real good at this point, being able to combat those creature lands that Dalton has. And he's just going to send both of his creatures saying, all right, I can kill you multiple ways. Let's see how you're going to block.
Yeah, and this really puts Dalton in a position where he really has no good blocks because there's no way he's going to be able to block with a Stirring Wildwood. As soon as he goes to activate it, Todd is probably just going to Ghost Quarter it. And then basically both of Todd's creatures have potential to trump Dalton's in combat.
Now, it looks like Dalton does have a copy of Shambling Vents in his land stack there, so he is going to be able to activate that with mana that he can gain from that Stirring Wildwood in response if he happens to try to use it as a blocker. That is going to gain him some life in this combat, but the larger toughness from that Stirring Wildwood is something that I think that Todd might be a little more Oh, and so this looks real bad considering that he can pump the Tarmogoyf and then use the Ghost Quarter on the Strain Wildwood, making all of the trample damage go through. If Dalton has no cards in hand, I have to imagine Todd's going to see this at some point and just win the game.
Yeah, this is exactly why the Ghost Quarter was such a good top deck, because now he'll be able to pump his Tarmogoyf, clear the blocker, and then all the damage is going to go through to Dalton.
It looks like he can pump it exactly 4 that's needed to bring it up to 9, which is going to exactly lethal Dalton.
Very, very well done by Todd Stevens, and also really showing how, this Abzan deck, the Abzan deck is such a good deck, and historically it's been one of the top contenders, but it's starting to fall out of favor with these other decks that just have such streamlined, proactive strategies. It's really hard for them to hang.
You have to feel like in this type of matchup, had he had something like Dark Confidant to continually fuel him cards so that he can draw into more removal against the Snide Company deck, then it might have gone a little bit better. Also, in that game, we didn't really see a lot of spot removal end up getting played. Path to Exile, Abrupt Decay are the cards that he needs to lean on to try and stem the bleeding from the threats that Todd Stevens is going to be deploying in his Snide Company deck. But then again, Collected Company is a very easy way to either catch him back up or just throw him way far ahead.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the real problem is that with the way this Abzan deck is set up, and a lot of the Abzan decks, because a lot of the Abzan decks aren't playing Dark Confidant, is they end up just being a bunch of 1-for-1s. And if